There is a moment in military history that does not fit any textbook. No formation of shields, no cavalry reserve, no siege towers waiting on the horizon. Just a vast column of men, women, and children moving through desert heat. And behind them, closing fast, the most sophisticated armed force the ancient world had ever assembled. This is the setup of the Exodus. And if you read it only as a religious story, you miss something that commanders have studied for thousands of years. Moses and the people of Israel had just left Egypt. As we read in Exodus chapter 14, Pharaoh looked out at his kingdom and made a decision. He would pursue them. He took 600 of his best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over each of them. The Egyptian army, horsemen, infantry, archers, moved as one. The greatest military machine of the ancient Near East was in full motion. Now, pause on that image. Because the tactical problem here is not just difficult, it is, by any rational calculation, impossible. The people of Israel had no standing army. They had no chariots, no trained archers, no professional infantry in formation. They had been servants in Egypt for generations, which means they had been deliberately kept from any access to weapons, horses, or military organization. Exodus chapter 1 verse 10 gives us the Egyptian rationale explicitly. The fear was precisely that a militarized Israel might one day turn against its captors. So, what you have, in pure tactical terms, is an unarmed civilian population, moving slowly, burdened with livestock and provisions, being pursued by a mobile strike force built around the most devastating weapon platform of the era, the Egyptian war chariot. And yet something is about to happen on that narrow strip of terrain between the sea and the desert that will define Israelite military thinking for centuries. Not because Moses was a general in the conventional sense, but because he made a decision that no purely human military logic would have recommended. That decision begins with a road. To understand what made the Egyptian military so formidable, you have to understand what Pharaoh sent into that pursuit. This was not a border patrol. This was the organized strike force of the New Kingdom, arguably the most advanced war machine the ancient world had yet produced. The centerpiece was the war chariot. Egypt had adopted and perfected the chariot from the Hyksos, the foreign dynasty that had conquered Lower Egypt around 1650 BCE. The Egyptians studied those invaders with extraordinary discipline and built something better than what had defeated them. By the time of the Exodus, scholars generally place it within the 13th century BCE, the Egyptian chariot had been refined into a lightweight two-wheeled vehicle pulled by two war horses, designed for speed and precision rather than brute force. Each chariot carried two soldiers. The driver held the reins and a shield, controlling the horses through sharp turns and rapid advances. The second man was the warrior, typically an archer equipped with the composite bow, the most technologically advanced ranged weapon of the era. This bow was not a simple piece of wood. It was a laminated construction of horn, sinew, and wood, materials with different tension properties bonded together under heat, capable of launching an arrow over 600 feet with armor-piercing force. A trained Egyptian chariot archer, firing from a moving platform, could strike targets at distances that infantry archers on foot could not reach. The charioteers themselves wore remarkable protection. Elite chariot warriors rode into the field in long coats of bronze scale armor, individual scales pierced and tied onto a linen or leather backing, sometimes more than 600 scales per coat, giving them a kind of articulated bronze shell that moved with the body while deflecting arrows and blade strikes. Supporting the chariot corps were the infantry divisions. Egypt organized its ground troops into distinct functional arms. Spearmen formed the forward defensive lines, paired with large wooden shields reinforced with hide. Archers operated in coordinated volleys, trained to loose in disciplined waves that would saturate a target area before the infantry closed. And then there were the axemen and sword-bearers carrying the khopesh, a curved, sickle-shaped bronze blade, blunt on the outer edge, razor-sharp on the inner curve, specifically designed to hook around an opponent's shield and deliver a slashing stroke that conventional straight swords could not replicate. Egyptian divisions were organized around the names of their gods: Amun, Ra, Ta, Set. Each one a self-contained unit with its own standard, its own command structure, its own chariot contingent, and its own infantry support. The divisional standard was more than symbolic. It was a command and control mechanism. Soldiers oriented on their standard in the chaos of battle. This is what pursued Israel out of Egypt. Not a raiding party. A fully operational, multi-armed military force. Chariots, composite archers, spearmen, axemen, scale-armored elites, moving in coordinated pursuit down the desert road. As Exodus chapter 14 verse 9 records, the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army overtook them encamping by the sea. Every military advantage belonged to Egypt. Every measurable variable, weapons, training, armor, mobility, numbers, pointed to a result that could have only one ending. Every measurable variable, that is, except the terrain Moses had already chosen. Here is the tactical decision that almost no one examines closely enough. Before Pharaoh even gave the order to pursue, Moses had already made a choice about the route. And that choice was not random. As recorded in Exodus chapter 13 verse 17, God directed Israel away from the shorter, more obvious road through Philistine territory, the coastal highway that Egyptian fortresses guarded with permanent garrisons. Instead, the column moved toward the sea, toward a corridor that cut between water and desert. Military analysts who have studied the geography of the Sinai have noted something that Moises intuited with what scholars have called a perspicace eye for tactical terrain, an ability that great commanders across history have shared. To read the land and see what it will do to an enemy who follows you onto it. The narrow strip between the Mediterranean and the marshy lagoon known in ancient records as the Serbonian Sea created a geographic funnel. And a funnel is the natural enemy of the war chariot. The Egyptian chariot's greatest asset was its mobility, the ability to swing wide, to flank, to encircle, to use its speed, to hit an enemy from multiple angles simultaneously. Egyptian chariots had encircled entire armies at battles like Megiddo, cutting off retreat routes by swinging around the enemy's perimeter. On the open desert plain, 600 chariots pursuing a slow-moving civilian column would have achieved exactly that. They would have spread wide, closed the flanks, and the pursuit would have ended there. But on a narrow coastal strip, flanking is impossible. The sea closes one side. Marshy terrain closes the other. 600 chariots, optimized for maneuver, are forced into a compressed corridor where their mobility becomes irrelevant, and where their weight and the weight of their horses becomes a vulnerability, not a strength. This is not coincidence. Exodus chapter 14, verse 25, records that the wheels of the Egyptian chariots were removed or became stuck. The text uses the Hebrew word that conveys the clogging or disabling of the mechanism. And the Egyptian officers themselves said, "Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against Egypt." The tactical logic is coherent with the terrain. Soft, saturated ground near the marshy corridor between sea and lagoon would have been precisely the environment where chariot wheels sink, where horses lose footing, where the speed advantage that makes a chariot deadly in open ground turns into a trap. Ancient records, including a Greek historian writing in the 1st century BCE, describe similar drowning events in this same geographic area when armies became caught between the sea and the lagoon during sudden inundations. Moses had moved a defenseless population through the one corridor in that region where the greatest armed force on earth could not use its most decisive weapon. And now consider the timing. The crossing happened at night. Exodus chapter 14 verse 21 describes a strong east wind that drove back the waters throughout the night. Israel crossed on dry ground in darkness. The Egyptian army did not pursue until morning, and by then, the Israelites were already on the other side. The Egyptians entered the same corridor in pursuit. But the timing of the return of the waters caught them in precisely the place where their equipment was most vulnerable. Night movement neutralized the Egyptian composite archers. Archers operating in darkness cannot coordinate volley fire. The psychological dimension compounds this. An army pursuing an enemy through a corridor at night, with water on one side and water on the other, and ground that the horses are struggling to traverse, is an army whose cohesion is already fracturing. If this analysis of biblical tactics fascinates you as much as it does us, if you want to keep exploring how the decisions of ancient commanders shaped the outcome of history's most studied battles, consider following this channel. Every week, we go deeper into the military logic behind the biblical narrative. Now comes the question that the text itself answers, and that military analysis alone cannot. Why did Moses win? From a purely tactical perspective, you can construct a coherent answer. Terrain selection, route discipline, timing, and the neutralization of the enemy's primary weapon. These are real factors. They are not trivial. The fact that a leader guiding a disorganized civilian population chose the one geographic corridor that would render 600 war chariots useless, and then crossed at a timing that allowed his people through while trapping the pursuing force, is a genuine exercise in what military theorists call minimizing adversary strengths while maximizing environmental factors. As the analysis of Moises and his route suggests, he demonstrated what great commanders understand instinctively: to make the battlefield itself a weapon. As Proverbs chapter 20, verse 18 states, and the book of Proverbs was likely compiled centuries after the Exodus, by wise guidance, you can wage your war. Moses understood this before the words existed on parchment. But the biblical account does not stop at the tactical layer. And if you stop there too, you are reading an incomplete text. Exodus chapter 14, verse 14 contains a statement that functions, militarily, as the operational order for the entire engagement. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. This is not passive theology. In the military context of the Exodus, it is a command about where to concentrate effort and where to withhold it. The people of Israel were not to attempt a conventional defense, which would have been futile against chariots, and were not to scatter in panic, which would have produced the same result. They were ordered to maintain discipline and movement along the designated route. And discipline in movement is, in itself, a military skill. The reason Moses won is located at the intersection of obedience and terrain. He followed a route not dictated by conventional military calculation. The shorter road with permanent Egyptian garrisons would have been the obvious choice by simple geography. But by a directive that routed him toward a corridor his pursuers could not exploit. The obedience was tactical. The terrain was the weapon. The timing was the trigger. And the defeat of Pharaoh's army was total. Not because Israel fought back, but because Israel moved correctly, and the environment did the rest. There is something in this that every subsequent Israelite commander, inherited as operational principle. The Book of Battles, drawn from the biblical record, shows that later commanders, whether dealing with chariot armies from Canaan or armored coalitions from Syria, returned repeatedly to this same logic. Use terrain, use timing, avoid the open field where the enemy's greatest weapon operates freely, and choose the corridor where discipline and geography together neutralize raw military superiority. Moises did not invent this principle. He received it, and in receiving it and following it without deviation, including crossing at night, including choosing the coastal strip rather than the fortified highway, he demonstrated that the greatest tactical resource available to Israel was not any weapon they carried, because they carried almost none. It was the quality of the directive they followed. As we read in Exodus, chapter 15, verse 3, "The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name." The battle narrative in that same chapter, the Song of the Sea, one of the oldest written texts in the Hebrew Bible, describes the Egyptian chariots sinking like lead into the water, not struck down by Israelite arrows, not overwhelmed by superior infantry. The weapon that had no answer was not a sword. It was the terrain, the water, and the timing, all operating together at the precise moment of encounter. That is the military signature of the Exodus engagement, and it is more complex than either pure faith or pure tactics can explain in isolation. The convergence of both is exactly what makes it worth studying, and exactly why it became the foundational military memory of an entire civilization.